Welcome. On behalf of IntelliSpark and School Counselor Central, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, focusing on teens, social media, and technology. My name is Dr. Matt Liberatore, Director of Professional Learning and Student Services in District 214, the second largest high school district in Illinois, and a Senior Advisor for IntelliSpark. I'm delighted to be moderating this conversation. Joining us to discuss how social media impacts students' day-to-day life at school, brain function, and overall social emotional well-being is Terrence Houlihan and Jeff Ream. Welcome, Terrence and Jeff. Feel free to unmute or to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks so much, Matt. Appreciate you having me. Honored to be here. So I am the director of a K-12 school counseling program up in Westchester County, New York, and also an adjunct lecturer at the City University of New York, Lehman College in the graduate program of education.
Awesome, great to have you.
Hi, my name is Jeff Ream. I'm an active school counselor and I live out in Northern California. I work at North Tahoe High School in the Tahoe-Truckee Unified School District. And we're a small rural comprehensive high school. And in addition to kind of my day-to-day job, I also run a website called The Counseling Geek, which some people may have heard of. A scholarship, e-commerce store. I'm a dad, I love to cook, and I love technology and I love to learn. So I'm excited to spend some time, whether it's the morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're at. It's the afternoon for me here. So thank you for joining us today.
Awesome, thank you for joining us. Before we begin the discussion, a few housekeeping details. During our conversation, if you have questions for us, please use the question and answer function, the Q&A function. We'll use the chat box to share our contact information with you and post other information. Our hope is to really have this be almost like a fireside chat and have it be a conversation. And so I'm going to open it up with some questions. We're going to watch the Q&A, and if some things come in, we're hoping to answer those questions and hopefully be able to walk away with this with a few nuggets that you can actually use starting today. So just kind of opening up here, and neither one of you can answer this, but what are some real life strategies you've used? Example, social media classes, student service interventions, or ways to handle social media and just how it's being used today, and obviously, the great impact it's having.
I mean, day to day working as a high school counselor, a lot of times I find myself actually addressing it almost indirectly. So it's kind of tagging along with different conversations that I'm having with students, whether it's a classroom, core curriculum lesson, or a presentation that we're giving, or things like that. So I mean, it could be tagged into things like setting goals. So if someone wants to become healthier, we talk a lot about sleep and stress and things like that. And while we're not necessarily addressing the technology, social media piece, face on, it definitely has that tangential effect of, let's talk about sleep. Let's talk about how much blue light, exposure you're getting and when that's happening, and the impact of, fear of missing out and things like that. And that teenagers, and I work with the teenage age, so I know that there's a broad range potentially of attendees that work with all different age groups. But my experience with high school students, that's a big focus, is kind of just that overall health, that technology, it plays a huge part of that a lot of times we don't think is an underlying factor. Sometimes that actually plays a huge pivotal component of it. And that's really what a lot of my real life strategies, we do some specific lessons and things like that, but it's really more tied into just that conversation. And how do we loop in those pieces and talk about it in a continual way that builds their awareness, but also creates that healthy approach to how they view technology and how they interact with it. I think that's the ultimate goal.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Jeff in that context. There are some rich sort of vehicles, to have these discussions. And, one in particular that has yielded a lot of positive results is a documentary or docudrama, so to speak, that came out from Netflix not too long ago called The Social Dilemma. Yep. And that was a great opportunity to, have discussions. And, speaking of technology, one of the vehicles is definitely media. In particular, I found over the last few years that Netflix has provided a lot of, video clips, documentaries, and also even, something like 13 Reasons Why was a nice bouncing off point to begin these conversations, because this is sort of like a field where both teens and adults meet. I'm sure that everyone realizes that there is kind of an us and them mentality when it comes to adolescence. They look at us like we are, no matter whether or not you're 27 or 47 or 67, you're old. And in their book and their mindset. So when we share an experience that we've had, that they've also had, it's kind of like a common ground where we can begin that conversation.
Yeah. And I do want to highlight the documentary Social Dilemma, because I think after watching that, it did make you look at it from a different lens. From obviously the ability to, from a consumer lens, to get you to come back and why it's built the way it is. So I do think that was a really valuable docuseries, and thank you for suggesting that. I do think a lot of what we've been talking about is, creating self-awareness, and how do we cultivate that self-awareness to have them understand that. But I guess the other piece to this, I always think is so interesting in the work that I do at a 7 high school district, is, how do you engage parents and get them to partner with you in their efforts, or have you seen successful models of this?
So it's sort of like two parts. How do we, engage them, and then what sort of things have, worked with them? In my experience, the parents are very eager for really any opportunity to learn a little bit more about social media and technology in general, because it's one of those generational gaps.
Yeah.
And it's something that, most of us just don't understand. And the way in which kids sort of approach this is, well, if they're on Facebook, we're getting on this. I'm sure a lot of people remember MySpace. Once we as adults sort of figured out MySpace, they were on Facebook. Once we figured out Facebook, they went to Snapchat. I don't think we've still figured out Snapchat to a large degree, but that's a lot of that. From a neurological standpoint, has to do with the way just that they grew up with it. So their neural connections are sort of wired to understand apps, and our neural connections are wired to sort of understand books, facial expressions. I still call my son, and he'll text me back. He's in his late 20s. He's like, "What's up?" So it's very much of a different language that we speak. So, Matt, I find a lot of parents are really eager for us in education to hold forums, whether they be parent presentations, whether they be Zoom sessions, resources, things along those lines. And then I'll let Jeff jump in, because I went on for a little bit.
No, thank you for your insight.
Yeah, I think you make a lot of really great points, and I would agree with all of them, I think. And I think I would just add that, it's really an opportunity for us in the schools to partner with parents, right? And so just like they're going to be partnering with their child, right? Because I think that's a big thing. Like, I think a lot of times when we think about how do we manage social media and technology, it kind of becomes this spy versus spy thing, where it's a battle and a combination, and it's almost like parents feel like they're spying on their child, but they want them to be safe, and it's unfortunate that that's the case, and I think really that's where, when students get to my age, it's a little bit tougher, or my age, the students I work with, because a lot of times those systems and how the family system is working is ingrained, and that it's been set. And so the opportunity for the younger parents of younger children, I'm thinking I have a 5-year-old and an 11-month-old, the parents of the younger children have a true opportunity to kind of develop that relationship and develop that trust. And so that line of communication. And so just like with anything, I would make an example of a car. we have a lot of teenagers learning how to drive, and it scares me a lot of times. But ultimately, they're going to drive a car, right? And just like our teens, they're ultimately going to have to be responsible for the technology that they use, for their interactions on social media, for the things that they're going to be engaging with as an adult, as a professional. And I think if we set up so many structures, and I think sometimes school districts might even get it wrong in the sense that they wall off so much of the internet at times, and that they don't give the children a chance to practice in a safe and controlled environment. And that's a big deal. And so that's something that I think talking with parents is a really important fact of how do we structure this support? And that's really what it is, the support of making good choices. To allow the parents to feel comfortable that their child is safe and in a sphere of the internet that will be appropriate for their age level, while also giving them the space where they don't have to feel like they're stuck under their parents' thumb at all times, because then they never get to grow. They never get to develop past that stage. And it's kind of the preacher's kid syndrome. When we release them out into society, all of a sudden there's this whole billions and trillions of websites out there that and different things that they've never been exposed to and had time to practice and kind of learn from at some levels. And so it's a hard dynamic. It really is. And you're right in that parents didn't grow up with that information. I mean, Google came around in 1997, the first iPhone in 2007. Like it's not been that, it feels like ages ago, but it really hasn't in the world, in the grand scheme of development. Technology is not that old. I mean, Instagram wasn't until 2011.
That's
like
wild.
it's not even been 10 years really since Instagram has even been released, and Snapchat is the same way. And so that's something we don't always think about. It just feels part of our normal life, right? And us as adults, we're probably just as addicted, if not more sometimes, than our kids. And so that's something we also have to realize too, is to kind of turn that picture inside, because I could probably name a couple parents that are probably worse at this than the children they're trying to support. And so it's something we have to kind of also self-reflect on as well. And I do as well as a technophile that likes to do this stuff. I have to kind of keep myself in check as well.
Well, I love that analogy of the driving the car, because in Illinois, with your permit, you can only drive with a parent, and then once you get past that, you can only have a couple participants in the car with you, passengers, before you're actually able to drive solo all on your own. And so in the light of that, kind of that step-by-step scaffold process, are there apps to help parents monitor their usage or to assist them in that process? I know on the iPhone, they've got, they got the parent stuff that's on there, but what have you seen or have you heard of stuff that works just as well?
Yeah, I've there's a couple out there. I'm sure if you just do a Google search, a couple of them will come up. But over the years, the ones that I've heard from families and ones that I've like verbally suggested to groups, one is called Bark. It's got a very catchy name, and then of course the Net Nanny. There's another one from Norton. I think it's called Norton Family, and Mama Bear. Those are the ones that I've shared with families. And the component, I think, from a parental perspective, that's really key is there's some parents who, especially in high school, will ask, what do you think about me going through my kid's phone? And my response is that's fine, as long as your child knows that was set up to begin with.
Yeah.
So that, at the end of the day, whoever's name is on that Verizon bill, that T-Mobile bill, that's who owns the phone. But that conversation needs to happen prior to the phone being delivered. And Jeff made some really excellent points before about that, safe space. And prior to that purchase of the iPhone as a gift, I think in the United States right now, the average age at which an adolescent gets it is 11. Yeah. Their brains are not fully developed to be able to make those appropriate decisions. and we can definitely get into that a little bit later with brain development, but that conversation might look like, look, this is mom's phone. This is daddy's phone. These are your parents' phones. And in order for you to gain access to it, there's a couple of things that are going to need to happen. So those parameters being set up early, it doesn't mean that that's going to be conflict free. I mean, it's the same idea with marriage. One of the reasons why divorce rates are so high in the United States is because most of us think that we're going to be happy when we get married. Marriage is a 4-letter word. It's work. It's the same thing with parenting. Nobody ever said there's not going to be any conflict. And the iPhone, the smartphone, social media has added another layer of conflict. And I get it as a parent. Sometimes it's easier to just say, go ahead, use it for 6 hours straight. So setting those parameters, that safe space to identify what does digital citizenship look like, all really, really important.
Yeah, and I actually had Bark on my mind too. I've not used it personally, but it's one that's always popped up when I've done research and things like that. So, and someone asked for a website. So bark.us is the website for that particular program. And the thing that stuck out about that program to me is it's not just responsive. So it's actively searching for things that potentially could be harmful, that allow you to act. And so those are things that can be conversation starters with students and kids. So it's not just an aha gotcha. It's hey, this, like, I know, like, I got a notification, and again, it shouldn't be secret. Like, this is not something that you should like pop on your kid. Like, I think a contract, we work a lot with contracts, and like setting up agreements, just like a parent sets up an agreement with their cell phone provider. A parent should set up an agreement with their child of, you're going to get this phone, like you said, and here's what we're going to expect of you. Yes, we're going to allow you privacy on your phone, but when we ask, we would also like to be able to ask you questions about your use. But I would also definitely encourage, and this is something I find is a very useful tool working with families and students, is changing the dynamic of parent to student to almost like coach and athlete of we're going to come into this as a team, right? It's not the parental, like mama bear, papa bear, I'm going to solve all your problems, things like that. It's really about the coach might get you in trouble. They might get you in trouble, but it's all for the right reason. And everyone's on the same team, right? So we're all moving towards that same common goal. And so with the contracts, a big piece of that is student being involved. So letting students develop, parents add some consequences, go right ahead, right? Add some like non-negotiables, things like that, but allow the student to do the same thing. Like, let the student also have a voice in that contract. Too often it's a one-sided contract. Do this, this, and this, or your phone's taken away. And students are going to buck against that system, right? That's their neurological development. They want to push that box. We all do as people, but it's especially prevalent in that age range. That buy-in allows them to set both their own boundaries. So like, here's when mom and dad can make, or mom and mom, or whoever it might be able to check, check on me, or like, here's the things that I know that they're going to be looking for. All right. And so they also can set their own consequences. And I would encourage that too. It lets them buy in the know, say, hey, if I'm on my phone after hours, here's the consequence that I'm going to set for myself. Okay. And then it's no longer mom told me this and it's all her fault. It's now, I know that I broke the consequence and I developed what my consequence was going to be. And so I know that I got to follow it. And that's a big thing. The other side of it that I also want to just make sure that people are aware of, and this is probably more prevalent as students get older, but we're seeing it happen younger and younger, is if there are definite ways around all of these tools that we mentioned, right? So if a student, and that's where that relationship and conversation about like appropriateness online, boundaries, things like that becomes most important, because it's free to get a VPN. It's free to get a proxy. Like, kids don't have to go through your system if they really don't want to. And I think if you've had kids or worked with kids for any amount of time, they will find a route to whatever their goal is, no matter what. And I think that's not something that we necessarily have to come down on. I think I honestly get, kind of like morbidly resourceful, but it also is something just to be aware of as parents. Like, these kids are, sometimes I call it like they're illiterate tech gods. Like, they don't understand exactly how it works, many of them. Like, if you ask them, like, how does this all function? they probably couldn't tell you, but they know how to get around things and they're very resourceful. And so understanding that there's not a, and I think we probably all know this, but there's not a silver bullet to protecting kids online or blocking off certain areas of the internet or certain apps or things like that. There's so many different ways that kids can access these things. And it's more about teaching those skills, that preventative stuff that we do as school counselors. That's really the model that we should be having with the same approach here. And so that's just one area that I think it's also good to have both perspectives. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do the app. Doesn't mean you shouldn't pursue that. I think those are good boundaries to create, but it's definitely not foolproof.
Yeah, I think the two things I hear is about, not using it, the consequences of like weaponizing the phone, right? Because it causes them to buck against it. And the other one is the digital citizenship. I love that term and phrase because it really does. It's really explaining the power behind these tools and the power that they carry. I think someone in the chat says you give them keys to the kingdom, and it is. Sometimes they don't realize what they're getting when they get access to a phone. Is there any particular opinion from either one of you about the age that someone gets a smartphone or should be given that, or any research or stuff that out there that supports this or not?
Well, when you look at the tech giants and their kids, they didn't give them their phones. They didn't give them access to this kind of technology well until what we would call middle adolescence. So it really wasn't until they're 14 or 15 for a lot of them. And even at that age, I mean, when you look at the adolescent brain, 16 is where a lot of the states say you can drive. The car accident rates, if you look at National Traffic and Safety Board statistics, the car accident rates are up here for 16-year-olds. If you put a second 16-year-old, the chances for a fatal accident double. You put a third teenager in that car, the chances for an accident triple. The numbers sound convenient, but they are factual, and it gives us evidence to how wired the adolescent brain is for risk. And it really just comes down to experience. You can't just show your child one time how to tie their shoelaces. You can't just show them one time how to make their bed. You can't just show them one time how to have a conversation with an adult. This is constant practice. And it goes back to one of the things Jeff had said earlier, this idea of creating a safe space for them to learn about it, to sort of, explore it. I would venture to say that it's really not until late middle school or early high school, but I know fully well the pressure that parents are getting and that social status symbol. Somebody typed it in the chat. It really starts to peak at about 12. And it's no coincidence when you look at the research, you'll see also that self-consciousness peaks at about 12 or 13. So you've got these storms coming together at the same time. And with this particular generation, we'll call them, the app generation or Gen Z. They are the true digital natives. They're probably going to revolutionize our society. For some people joining it, hearing all these things may sound a little frightening and overwhelming because it's new, it's stuff that we're not well aware of, and all this risk. But all of us got through. I'm part of Generation X. I survived flexible flyers. I rode my bike without a helmet and things like that. They'll get there. It's a matter of being there with them and showing them. And I think they are going to be one of the most revolutionary generations to come along. They've been in school during a pandemic.
Yeah.
This is going to shape the way in which they view the world as adults. And I know I'm throwing a lot of stuff out there. So I'm going to stop there.
Well, speaking of pandemic, the question here, what changes have you noticed from pre-COVID to becoming virtually and tech reliant during COVID? What have you seen, and then specifically around, even the teen brain and brain functioning?
From a social emotional perspective, Interestingly enough, Matt, what was fascinating is that the research showed that in the beginning of COVID, when there were, my school is literally 0.25 miles out of the epicenter of where the New York outbreak was. We shut down school, and then the National Guard came in last March. And the research showed between March and June, depression rates for teenagers across the United States actually decreased because they were getting more sleep, because kids weren't signing on until 8:30, or they might not even had virtual classes. So interestingly enough, depression rates went down, and then after the summer they started to go back up, and then we saw anxiety rates go up as well. And kids are reporting this concept of almost like a timelessness, that the days sort of flow into one another. And we all experience, we're zoomed out, we've got pandemic fatigue, things like that. So it's done it's made its impact on the adolescent brain. It's made an impact on all of us. But just like every experience, we have the capacity to be resilient. Humans adapt. We adapted to this. We've changed our model to some degree or another. We've lamented it. Teachers are burnt out. Parents are burnt out from it, but we've gotten through it. I think long term they'll develop some resiliency skills, but initially there's been an impact on them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say, we're now back with about 90% of our students since February at my school in person. And so it's been amazing too. I think one of the big things, and I would agree, there's been a lot of really terrible things that have come from this. But I also think that kind of like positive outlook thing also is an important thing to carry with us. And there's a lot of we've all had to learn technology really quickly. Students included. And I think that can actually be a benefit. And I would definitely agree. We start around 8 a.m. and we go until 12:20 at my school. And kids want to, and teachers and everybody else want to stick with that schedule. Like it's amazing. They're saying we are getting the same amount of stuff out of school in that time frame without 2 hours and waking up later and having that time to do sports and study and spend time with my friends and other things that are important in life. Than we were with 6-hour days. And it's kind of amazing to kind of realize that. And I would definitely echo the sleep thing. That's a huge, I think, issue in this country that also it has a direct correlation to that technology component as well. The other thing that I think has come out of it is kids have changed how they view school, right? Before the pandemic, if I asked a kid, if I gave you the chance to not have to come to school, would you take it? Good chance many of them would say, absolutely, I take it, sign me up. And they go and do 14 months of quarantine. And now that same kid, I asked them, what do you think about school? They're like, get me back in school as soon as I can possibly be there. And I think that is a blessing in disguise as well, as it's changed the outlook on the true need of that building, and that technology cannot replace everything. It's a supplement, right? It cannot supplant. And so that's a big thing that we have to realize as a society as well, is I think we're supplanting too much. And I think that from this COVID experience, we will hopefully do more supplementation of our work as educators, but really make sure that kids know that in-person interaction is an important thing. And we might have to reteach some of that stuff, right? Kids have lost, I've seen it. Kids have lost the ability to talk to their friends, right? And even more so than before, right? They still were like Snapchatting in a circle, but now it's even worse because they kind of forgot that engagement piece, that interpersonal relationships.
Yeah. It's such a great point, Jeff, because I think a few years back, many of us had heard about, you can do an assessment and figure out whether or not you're a visual learner, or you can figure out if you're an auditory learner or a kinesthetic learner. And, there's no empirical evidence of that. Somebody made a heck of a lot of money off of that idea.
Yes.
Because it sounds great. and it seems to make sense, because who doesn't want to read a book with pictures in it? Because that means it's less cognitive effort to interpret the words. So kids would say, yeah, I'm a visual learner, or in a science lab, yeah, I'm kinesthetic. What that movement really downplayed and sort of skipped over, and what we're finally appreciating, is that real learning is emotional.
Mm.
That without that connection, and I'm not just talking about teacher student, I'm talking about student to student. I'm talking about within the family system, within friends. Without that, things are not being reinforced. Anecdotally, I can tell you, kids would just say, I can't ask questions on Zoom. I can't like stick around after class and sort of like, just shuffle my way out of the classroom and then turn to the teacher and ask a question about the Pythagorean theorem. It's just, they're on the lesson and then boom, they're off. So that emphasis on the personal connection is, I'm hoping that that's what comes out of it. I've been in education for over 25 years. Never did I imagine a 15-year-old saying, it's good to see you, Mr. Houlihan. I'm happy to be back.
Yeah. Speaking of, what are some of the blind spots, and what will happen going forward, do you think? I mean, I think, to speak to Jeff's point of looking at the positive, is, what will happen moving forward, or what are some of the takeaways that you think we can bring forward when it comes to technology and social media? And I'd like to break them up a little bit, because technology and social media, they are different and synonymous in the same.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can tell you from living up in the mountains, our snow days are going to look very different.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a small thing. And I think most people ho-hum about it. And I do too. I think snow days are useful for shoveling, but it's something that's going to change just how we engage. Like, we have a ski academy program at our school, and things look different when kids can join their class from Austria or wherever they might be, if they need to, and can access teachers. And I think it's changed our teaching approach as well, because teachers also like, kids probably knew how to do this before, but the teachers might not have been comfortable. And so now everyone's kind of on a very similar page in terms of some of the technology, kind of like unspoken rules of how things are supposed to work in a school. And so I think that's a benefit. I would say a big blind spot going forward is how frequently technology changes. Just like trying to keep up is a challenge, and understanding the different changes that take place over time. Every year a new app or new platform comes out, and it causes us to have to kind of reevaluate things, and can totally undermine some of the work that we've already put a lot of effort and energy into, because it bypasses some of the big things that we've developed, or things like that.
Yeah, to echo that, I am nervous about not having snow days because of the importance of that experience of for a 7-year-old, for a 12-year-old to anticipate that and then have a break from it. So one of the unfortunate things with technology, with emails, with texting, is that it's created a challenge for all of us with setting up appropriate boundaries in our lives. And there are people, as director, I tell, the people under me, do not answer emails on the weekends. That is your time. After 5 p.m., do not answer emails. If it's an emergency, I will call you. Trust me.
Yeah.
So that, to a large degree, I think as a society, we need to reevaluate that, and setting up those appropriate, boundaries for work, play, life, that balance. So that's one of the things that we really need to, analyze, and whether or not it's beneficial. The other thing too that I know is that PD for teachers will most likely change. Because it will be much more cost effective to do these. But I've done a lot of PDs, and teachers report there. By the way, teachers are a very challenging audience to work with, but they can also be a heck of a lot of fun, especially if you get them up, moving, interacting with one another. et cetera. They take such great value with it because that's the same way in which kids operate. All of us do. We need that physical piece. So I hope that we really can keep technology sort of like, as Jeff said before, as a supplement, as a tool. If it becomes the end in itself, I think we as a society are toast. Forget about our kids. But if that's what it becomes, then I think we've got more things to worry about.
Well, I'd like to echo, just the reiteration around digital citizenship, right? Because creating boundaries around when to answer emails, that's a skill they can learn in school that they will carry forward, because you see people getting stuck working till 9 o'clock at night and not being able to follow those boundaries. And so when we talk about that brings me to my next question is, what is the correct balance or exposure to news and current events and not watching, right? I know I'm going to be honest, if you looked at my app usage or my screen time, I have a news thing called Flip It, and I'll tell you that has the max on there, and I actually know that I need to take my news breaks, because you can get stuck in that cycle. And I think the same is true for kids. And I guess I just am asking both of your opinions on this one.
I mean, I think it's definitely an individual perspective, and I think you can pull tons of different people and they'd all have different viewpoints. And I think they probably have many valid points, right? It's important to be engaged. It's important to be involved in our society and understand what's going on. But we also have to realize a lot of news is skewed one direction. It's very negative typically. It's very, there's a lot of bias, just like in our work, in our lives, everyone has bias, and so does the news. And I think that's an important thing, is understanding. And I think a lot of our English departments and history departments in high schools do spend time on this. For example, what is a reputable and balanced news source look like, and things like that, and understanding how to evaluate sources, right? So for any type of thing, so that could be research, it could be news, understanding how they're getting their data and where it's coming from is probably more of an important skill that lets them balance. The other piece that I think is important is also kind of not just flooding those negative news sources, trying to find those things that motivate you, right? So the things that share the good news because believe it or not, even in 2020, there was good things happening in this world that never got in the news, right? And so it's important for us to actively seek those out too. And we do usually have to actually seek, it's not usually the front page of the news. And so that's an important thing to just kind of pause and think about, is how do we make sure that our news sources, because on Flip It or these other apps, a lot of times you're pulling in the different sources that you want to read from, right? And so if you pull in CNN or Fox or whatever you want to go look at, there's different things that you're going to get, but also seeking out things that are primarily focusing on the positive. I really like John Krasinski's Good News Network. I mean, the stuff that's online, that's exactly what students need. They need to see some of the stuff. Otherwise this is doom and gloom outlook, and it just perpetuates that anxiety about leaving school, right? Working with students and seniors this time of year, they're scared, a lot of them. And if they're not, they probably have their head buried in the sand a lot of times, because they don't, sometimes it's a very scary world to walk into as a young adult that's never really had to truly walk on it by themselves, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a big thing that we have to kind of encourage, balance. Balance is good in everything, right? So balancing out news sources, we got to be aware of the maybe negative things that are happening in the world, but we got to be purposeful about finding the good too.
Yeah.
I don't know if either of you are familiar with the Gottman method. It comes from John Gottman. He does a lot of work in couples counseling. And one of the things that, and interestingly enough, Gottman, his training was in data. He was a researcher. He wasn't really a counselor or a therapist by nature. And he sort of got into this because he started looking at the numbers, and, he's pretty much revered because based on some of the stuff that he's done, 90% of the time he can predict whether or not a couple is going to stay together. And what Gottman and others have found is that for functioning couples, happy couples, for every one sort of criticism that they give to their partner, there should be 4 positive statements. So if we were to sort of work out a mathematical formula, I would say that's kind of 20% of the time, So our news sources really need to be limited in terms of the negative. It's a challenge because evolutionary psychologists and neurologists will tell you that the brain is wired to seek out things that will help it survive. And one of the unfortunate pieces with regards to the pandemic, with regards to any negative news cycle, is the outlets know this. And they know that what's going to sell, what's going to get advertising dollars in is by people viewing. So they are going to pump negative news out there. And kids have actually developed the term doom scrolling. They know it, they're aware of it, but it's almost as if they can't help themselves going through it. And this is what we do, is that we look for things to reinforce negative beliefs. So it is quite a challenge, and it is very much like exercise. We have to seek out positive news sources. We have to seek out information that is not going to flood our brain with negativity. It's a practice, but it's something that can happen. And I think parents and educators need to model it for students.
Yeah. I want to add something to that, because it kind of ties also to our last question about the blind spots, and that I think in education in general, we try to shoulder so many different things that we have to take on to support. And I think it's something that we kind of also kind of cripple ourselves a little bit with. And I think this is something we also have to tap in the other resources, because what you're saying, Terrence, is right, is that the news sources, Facebook, all these people know exactly how to addict us, right? They know they're not dumb. No. They make billions of dollars off of our psychology and understanding how we engage with their platform and information. And so I think it's important for us also to use our voice to advocate for the different things that are going through different laws or regulations and things like that. I mean, you look at net neutrality and different things like that allow us to have appropriate, sources and things like that, where our views can't be shaped. Right. So like, our cable company's not going to be able to direct us to a particular website because that they're getting paid to. Right. So, I mean, those things are going to be important to advocate that we're not the only ones having to educate on this and having to fight these battles, because it is it's another pandemic. It really is, in terms of what students are and adults. It's not just kids. This is a worldwide, all ages issue.
Yeah. Well, just kind of turning a little bit as we get closer to the end, what are the most critical privacy and identity theft risks for teens right now, would you say?
I would say you have to kind of define what safety and privacy are, because I think in schools we focus a lot on safety, right? So cyberbullying, online predators, things like that. When we do lessons at any grade level, that's usually what it's revolving around, and that is very important, right? So safety is probably the first concern, and probably should be. But I think we do ignore a lot of the privacy piece, and that kind of comes from the second standpoint and can have some different lasting types of impacts, right? So we have, both I'm allowing a company to benefit off of my own personal information, for example. So allowing Facebook to know too much information about you can maybe not have direct impacts. You might not never know that, but ultimately it can. You look at, for example, the confirmation hearing of Brett Kavanaugh. Stuff that he posted on his social media, right, came back to bite him in the butt, maybe rightfully so, down, many, many years later. And so the stuff that we're also doing, and it might not be like what he posted. I mean, we're not going to go in that direction, but like realistically, what people post online might not have a direct impact on their safety, but it can directly impact their privacy, right? And that there's no statute of limitations in terms of when that can happen. Right. And so that's something that's important for students to realize. I work in high schools, colleges, admissions officers, employers, all check social media. And so if they're seeing these different things, and we've seen news articles that come up about that exact circumstance. And so teaching it not only just about safety, but also about privacy is also a very important thing. So I think the biggest thing that students and parents can encourage is lock down their profiles. So that's probably the first and easiest thing to do. And that will shave off a good percentage of some of that risk. And so making sure their profile is private.
Thank you for that.
I like to sometimes ask students if they've ever seen a sanitation truck come by and take away the garbage. And then I'll ask them, where does it go? and some of them might say a dump, some of them will say I don't know, and I'll say, well, where does it go after the dump? And the point behind this lesson is to let them know that information does not disappear just because you delete a tweet. That as long as somebody has enough time and money, they will be able to find that information. The likelihood that, you know, a posting that you put up at 16 will come back when you're, you know, in your mid 30s or so is very small, but it's still a risk that's out there. And sometimes we may think as educators, you know, just because we did that lesson or you know, put out this survey, shared this clip, that it doesn't have an impact. I'll share a quick story with you. A senior stopped by my office today and he said, I have it marked in my calendar when I can friend you on Facebook. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, when we were freshmen, you said you will not be friends with any of us until 10 years after we graduate. And that is something that I tell students that, and I will say to them, you know, I have enough friends, I don't need friends, but here's the bottom line. I draw a very clear boundary with them, and it sticks. Obviously with this kid, it was a joke. He said, I put it in my calendar, but they heard that. They heard that boundary. They heard the idea that there are some things that young kids and teenagers do online, which is very risky. I don't want to necessarily be associated with it. So, you know, for those of you who think that sometimes what you're doing in classes, what you're doing in individual sessions and groups doesn't make an impact, this is it's a tough field because we don't necessarily see the direct results that we may see if, we work for a hedge fund. But this information does stick with them.
Yeah.
The only other thing I would add to that question would be kind of more along the lines of, like, apart from the elderly population, kids and teens are the second most common people to have their identity stolen. And so, no one's checking your credit report as a 10-year-old, right? So, it's something that you have to kind of understand too, that, people are shifty. They what's the name of your dog? What's the name of your aunt? Like, what's your middle name? Where were you born? Like, those are all security question answers, right? And so that's really easy to gain access to personal accounts, and it's kind of a ladder, right? So you gain access to a kid. It's pretty simple to then gain access to a parent and things like that. And so it's just a very important thing that kids have to be aware of. And the only other piece is their passwords. And us as adults probably could use lessons in that too. But I mean, you can have anything from numbers. I have a chart up here that we can't share, but I mean, you have a 11 character only number password that's cracked in 6 minutes, right? Your passwords are your weakest link. And so if you're not using that, and how you store them, right? If you're putting on a Post-it note on your computer, that's really easy. Or even worse, the Notes app of your phone, which most probably adults and kids do. It's a very dangerous thing to do, because you're like the person said, keys to the castle, right? You are giving access to some of the most private information that will probably still be there years from now. And so you want to start these habits young, in terms of kind of like having this strong sense of, digital security is also an important thing for kids to learn and grow up with, so that they're not impacted by identity theft or phishing scams and the things that also impact us as an adults that we always talk about. We don't think that kids need to hear about it until they experience it themselves.
Yeah. Well, as we're 10 minutes to the hour, I just wanted to first and foremost thank both of you, but then also ask you if there's any other highlights or points you'd like to make, or if we want to open it up to the attendees, and if anybody has any questions in the chat, any final questions in the chat box, we're more than willing to take those.
Let's see.
I do want to just say about those password questions. I do find it interesting sometimes when people are filling out those Facebook questions and sharing them with all their friends, and it is literally all the security questions. What was your first dog's name, and what was the first street you lived on? And it's like, if someone gets into the wrong hands, it can be used against them.
Yeah, I would say, another couple of things, jumping back a couple of questions potentially, but I think it's an important maybe revelation too, is we talk about the social emotional impacts of Instagram and kind of like this perfect life mentality of like, we only see the perfectness of other people online. Right. And so I think that's one element that we have to really pay close attention to and do some active work in, is identifying like, this is not, and there's so many people that edit their photos and all these, like, this is not reality, right? This is alternate reality.
Yeah.
And it's an important thing for kids to know and adults to know. But I think going back to kind of like the emailing after hours and stuff like that, that's a direct, I mean, kids have their Facebook that they take home after hours, and that's why the cyberbullying happens at, they can't escape it. We as adults do the same thing, but with work. Right. And so it's something that as an adult, we also have to kind of realize and model. And I will be perfectly honest, I do answer emails after my work. I don't let it interrupt my other activities that I'm involved in, but it does help me manage a couple of things. But I think it's an important thing to know your own boundaries, and also know what you're sacrificing if you break those boundaries. Right. And so like, what are you giving up? Me, it would be giving up time with my family or my friends or working out or the things that keep me healthy and sane. And I think that's an important thing. Like, what are you giving up to be on social media all night? What are you giving up to edit your photos? What are you giving up to do something that maybe makes you uncomfortable online? Like, those are all things that, we see the negatives, but we also don't see what they're also giving away in terms of that process.
Yeah, I want to, in that context, I want to also, it came up earlier in the conversation, how their sleep is impacted and how even our sleep is impacted. Finally, some school systems have really caught on to the neuroscience that the adolescent sleep clock gets pushed back by about 2 to 3 hours in the beginning stages of puberty. And so they were, at one time as little kids, they might have been going to sleep or even getting tired, say 8:30, 9 o'clock. They're really not getting tired now until 11:30. Many students report that they just can't go to sleep. And then when they are in bed, they might be on this, they might be on their tablets or something like that. And many of the products now have figured out that there's a certain amount of light that interferes with the production of melatonin, but it's still, our brains are still active. We're not training our brains to get ready for sleep. And then the research from the National Sleep Foundation shows that 56% of teens nap. And they're not napping, for 20 minutes or 25 minutes, the power nap. They're napping for like 3 or 4 hours. That's not napping. That's sleep. And so they're not falling asleep that night until 3 or 4 in the morning. And then they're getting up and they're functioning at a constant deficit. And some really interesting research came from Judith Brown, who's over at Brown University, and looking at PET scans of sleep-deprived teens in Sleep Lab and teens who were clinically diagnosed with ADHD, their brains matched. So, a lot of, the teenage sort of experience, especially in 2020, 2021, is they're operating on a sleep deficit. And technology, social media, and our society, to a large degree, are connected to that. So we need to model for them the appropriateness. We need to educate them about it. In order to function at its best, the adolescent brain needs 9 hours and 15 minutes of sleep per night. And anytime I share that number, parents and kids are like, there's no way that that's happening. And I've actually encouraged some people to try experiments. And it goes back to, Jeff's point. It's what's important to you. What are you willing to sort of give up? And if it's doing an hour and a half less of doom scrolling, if it's an hour and a half less of going through YouTube videos, it is possible. And everyone who does it reports positive results. But it goes back to FOMO, this idea that I'm missing out on something.
Yeah. And I think it's creating awareness around that doom scrolling, right? Like, it's okay that you're scrolling, but at least know that you're scrolling and know that you can put it away, as opposed to being pulled into that. Well, I just want to thank both of you for this awesome conversation and this wealth of information that you provided. We appreciate IntelliSpark and School Counselor Central for bringing all of us together this afternoon. As teens are trying to navigate so many forces acting on them, with social media and technology being amongst that list, so often all on their own as they experience such isolation. It is more important than ever that we as educators plan to build strong relationships with our students by effectively finding out how they are doing and then supporting them effectively. IntelliSpark makes this possible, and for everyone on the student's team to know how they're doing and what the collective team is doing to support that student. To learn more about IntelliSpark's innovative technology providing holistic student support and access to their student success tools at no cost, please visit IntelliSpark.com. A recording of this webinar will be made available, and I invite you to share it with colleagues who could not attend. Thanks to our panelists for this thoughtful conversation, and all of you for attending this webinar. Be on the lookout for our next webinar on May 19th to discuss implementing successful MTSS in your school and district. Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you for your time as panelists. It's been great.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.